journey back to Gorillist. The news of his father's failing health struck Ruda with the force of a thunderbolt, tearing through the facade of strength and composure he had maintained amid the chaos of conquest and diplomacy. Eurus, the man who had been Ruda's rock, lay gravely ill, thousands of kilometers away in the homeland he had fought so fiercely to protect and lead. Ruda's decision to return home was immediate and resolute. The weight of governance, the intricate web of alliances he had painstakingly woven, all seemed to pale in comparison to the urgency of his father's condition. The pressing demands of ruling an empire could wait. Now, there was only the urgent need to be by his father's side. The journey back to Gorillist was a blur of restless anticipation and anxious thoughts, each passing hour filled with a growing dread. Memories of his childhood flooded Ruda's mind, days filled with warmth, laughter, and the unwavering love of his parents. His father's wisdom and guidance had shaped Ruda into the leader he had become, and now, as Eurus's life waned, Ruda felt an overwhelming need to repay that love and devotion by being there in his father's final moments. Upon arrival, Ruda rushed to his father's bedside, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The sight that greeted him was a painful reminder of the fragility of life. Eurus, once a towering figure of strength and authority, now lay frail and weakened by illness and the inexorable passage of time. The man who had been a pillar in Ruda's life now seemed like a shadow of his former self. Ruda's heart clenched at the sight, and for a moment, he was overcome with emotion. Yet, as he took his father's hand in his own, there was a flicker of recognition in Eurus's tired eyes, a glimmer of the strength that had defined him for so long. "Father," Ruda whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm here. I've come back." Eurus's eyes, once so full of vitality, now held a deep weariness, but also a quiet determination that had always been a hallmark of his character. "Ruda," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, "my son." In that moment, a lifetime of memories surged through Ruda's mind, memories of a childhood sheltered by love, of lessons in leadership and courage, of quiet moments shared between father and son. Eurus had been more than just a father. He had been a mentor, a confidant, a guiding light in the darkest times. For hours, they sat together in silence, the bond between them unspoken but profoundly felt. Eurus shared stories of his youth, tales of love and loss, dreams fulfilled and those left behind. He spoke of Ruda's mother, whose beauty and grace had left an indelible mark on both their lives. As he spoke, a bittersweet smile touched his lips, as if he were already preparing to reunite with her in the next life. "Maybe it's time for me to meet your mother," Eurus whispered, his voice filled with a gentle longing. To be with her again. The words hung in the air, a poignant reminder of the inevitable passage of time and the mortality that awaited them all. Ruda listened, his heart heavy with the knowledge that soon, he would have to say goodbye to the man who had been his anchor in life. As the hours passed, Eurus's condition continued to deteriorate. His breathing grew labored, and his movements slowed. Yet, even as death drew near, there was a serenity in Eurus's gaze, a calm acceptance that spoke of a life well lived, a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. Ruda sat by his father's side, holding his hand tightly, unwilling to let go. In those final moments, the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in the quiet stillness of the room. The city outside hummed with life, but here, in this small space, time seemed to stand still. The burden of secrets. The room was heavy with an oppressive silence as Ruda sat by his father's bedside, his thoughts swirling like a maelstrom. Eurus, once a towering figure of strength and wisdom in Ruda's life, was now a shadow of his former self. The illness that had taken hold of him had drained him of vitality, leaving behind a frail, weakened body that seemed barely able to contain the man Ruda had always idolized. The soft hum of the medical equipment was the only sound that punctuated the stillness, each beep a reminder of the inevitable march of time. For Ruda, this moment was surreal. The man who had taught him everything, who had shaped his worldview and guided him through life's most challenging moments, now lay before him, vulnerable and frail. Eurus had always been a hero in Ruda's eyes, a paragon of virtue and strength. He was the man who had fought for Gorillist's rise to power, making the hard decisions that others couldn't or wouldn't. But now, as Hurus struggled with the weight of secrets long kept, Ruda could sense that the image he had of his father was about to be shattered. Hurus's eyes, once clear and commanding, were now clouded with a mixture of pain and regret. He struggled to breathe, each gasp a reminder of the fragility of life. Yet, despite his weakened state, there was a determination in his gaze, a need to unburden himself before it was too late. Ruda, Hurus whispered, his voice a fragile thread that barely rose above the hum of the machines. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you long ago. Ruda leaned in closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always known there were parts of his father's life that remained hidden, things Hurus had never shared with him. But the gravity of Hurus's tone now sent a chill down Ruda's spine, and he realized that whatever his father was about to confess would change everything. I've done things that have weighed on my conscience for years, Hurus continued, his voice cracking with emotion. And now, as I near the end of my life, I can no longer keep these secrets from you. You deserve to know the truth, even if it means seeing me in a different light. Ruda's breath caught in his throat as he listened, his mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. What could his father have done that was so terrible? He had always known Hurus to be a man of action, someone who wasn't afraid to make the tough calls, but the fear in Hurus's voice hinted at something far darker. It all began with Kaki, Hurus said, his voice trembling as he spoke the name. Kaki was a powerful figure in the military, a man with influence, and a rival who stood in the way of my ambitions. I saw him as a threat to everything I wanted to achieve, for myself, for our family, and for Gorillist. And in my desperation, I made a decision that has haunted me ever since. Ruda felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he heard the name. Kaki was a figure shrouded in legend within Gorillist, a warrior whose reputation for bravery and skill was unmatched. His sudden and mysterious death had always seemed a tragic loss to the nation, but now Ruda was beginning to understand that there was more to the story than he had ever known. I couldn't let Kaki stand in my way, Hurus confessed, tears welling in his eyes. So I hired someone who was known for getting the job done, no matter the cost. His name was Jess, a Hyenian assassin with a reputation for being ruthless, efficient, and deadly. I paid him to eliminate Kaki, to remove him from the picture so that I could achieve my goals without opposition. Ruda's heart sank as the realization hit him. His father had orchestrated an assassination, a cold-blooded murder to further his own ambitions. The image of Hurus as a hero, as a man of honor and integrity, shattered before his eyes. The pain of the revelation was almost too much to bear, but Ruda knew there was more to the story, more that he needed to hear. Just carried out the assassination, Hurus continued, his voice heavy with sorrow. But it didn't go as smoothly as planned. Kaki was no ordinary man, he was a fighter, a warrior to the core. When Jess and his gang of hyenas ambushed him on the road, Kaki fought back with a ferocity that none of them had anticipated. He killed 15 of Jess' men before they finally managed to overpower him. Ruda's mind raced as he imagined the scene, Kaki, outnumbered and outgunned, fighting with every ounce of strength he had, refusing to go down without a fight. The thought of such a valiant man being cut down in the prime of his life filled Ruda with a profound sense of loss and anger. Kaki was gravely injured, Hurus said, his voice breaking with emotion. But he managed to escape and make his way back home. I didn't know how badly he was hurt. I didn't realize the toll the fight had taken on him. He died at home that night, surrounded by his family. His wife, she couldn't bear the loss. She took her own life shortly after, unable to live without him. The weight of the confession hung heavy in the air as Ruda struggled to process the enormity of what he had just heard. His father had not only been responsible for the death of a great man, but had also indirectly caused the death of Kaki's wife. And then there was Xion, their son disappeared, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. What happened to Xion? Ruda asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hurus shook his head, his expression one of deep regret. He vanished, Ruda. After his parents' deaths, no one knows what happened to him. He was just a baby, alone in the world, with no one to turn to. I've searched for him over the years, trying to find some way to make amends, but it's like he disappeared into thin air. I'll never forgive myself for what I've done to him, to his family. Ruda felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to his father's confession. The pain in Eurus's voice was palpable, the regret and sorrow etched into every word. And yet, despite the horror of what he had done, Ruda couldn't help but feel a deep, conflicted sense of love for the man who had raised him, who had guided him through life with a firm but caring hand. "Father," Ruda said, his voice trembling with emotion, "why are you telling me this now? Why after all these years?" Eurus looked at his son, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and despair. "Because I can't carry this burden any longer, Ruda. I'm dying, and I don't want to leave this world with these secrets weighing on my soul. You needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it is. You deserve to know who I really am, and to understand the choices I made." Ruda struggled to find the words to express the whirlwind of emotions raging within him. Anger, sorrow, betrayal, and love all collided within his heart, leaving him torn between condemning his father for his actions and embracing him for the love he had always shown. "What you did was wrong, Father," Ruda said, his voice choked with tears. "But I understand why you did it. You were trying to protect me, to protect our family, but the cost was too high. So many lives were destroyed because of your choices." Eurus nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know, Ruda. I've lived with that guilt every day since it happened. But I did it all for you, for your future. I wanted to clear the path for you, to make sure you would have the power and influence you needed to lead Gorillist. But in doing so, I lost sight of what truly mattered. I lost my soul." Ruda placed his hand on his father's, feeling the frailty of the man who had once seemed invincible. The weight of his father's confession hung heavy between them, but there was also a sense of closure, a release from the secrets that had bound them for so long. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, Father," Ruda admitted, his voice tinged with sadness. "But I do love you. And I'll carry the lessons you've taught me, both the good and the bad, forward as I lead Gorillist. I'll make sure that our nation prospers, and that your legacy, despite its flaws, will be one of strength and resilience." Eurus smiled weakly, his eyes closing as he felt the weight of the world finally lift from his shoulders. "That's all I could ever ask for, Ruda. That you learn from my mistakes, and become the leader I always knew you could be." The rigged victory. The low hum of medical equipment filled the room, a constant reminder of the fragility of life as Eurus lay on his bed, his strength waning with each passing moment. Ruda, seated beside his father, felt the weight of the recent revelations hanging heavily in the air. The man he had revered as a hero, a paragon of virtue, had revealed a side of himself that Ruda had never imagined. Yet, despite the shock and the pain, Ruda remained by his father's side, compelled to hear the final truths Eurus needed to share. Eurus's breath was labored, and his once sharp eyes were now clouded with the weariness of a lifetime of burdens. As he gathered the strength to speak, Eurus turned his gaze to Ruda, the son who had followed in his footsteps, who had risen to greatness, but not entirely on his own merit. "Ruda," Eurus began, his voice raspy but resolute. "There's another thing you should be aware of, something about how you rose to the rank of Admiral of Gorillist." Ruda felt a pang of anxiety at his father's words. The title of Admiral had been a crowning achievement in his career, a moment of triumph that had solidified his path to leadership. He had always believed he had earned it through his own skill and determination. But the tone in Eurus's voice hinted at something darker. "What do you mean, Father?" Ruda asked, a note of apprehension creeping into his voice. "Are you saying that my win wasn't legitimate?" Eurus closed his eyes for a moment, as if summoning the strength to confess a sin that had weighed heavily on him for years. When he opened them again, there was a deep sorrow in his gaze, a regret that had been festering in his soul. "You were always a brilliant strategist, Ruda," Eurus said slowly, "but the competition to become Admiral, it was more than just a test of skill. It was a test of influence, of power. And I couldn't bear the thought of you losing. Not after all we'd worked for, not after all I'd done to clear the path for you." Ruda's heart pounded in his chest, the implication of his father's words beginning to take shape in his mind. The Potential Admiral Committee was the most prestigious and rigorous military competition in Guerrillist. It was a gauntlet that tested the mettle of the most promising officers, pushing them to their limits in strategy, combat, and leadership. Ruda had believed he had emerged victorious through his own abilities, but now doubt began to creep in. Hurus continued, his voice growing fainter with each word. There was a judge, a man named Gavrin. He was on the committee that oversaw the final stages of the competition. You were in the lead, Ruda, but then you made a mistake, a tactical error that almost cost you everything. The other judges wanted to give you a red card to disqualify you from the competition. But I couldn't let that happen. Ruda's mind flashed back to that critical moment in the competition. He remembered the pressure, the split-second decisions that could make or break his chances. He had known it was a close call, but when the red card wasn't issued, he had believed it was because the judges recognized his ability to recover from his mistake. Now, he was beginning to see the truth. What did you do, father? Ruda asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I used my influence, Hurus admitted, the words heavy with guilt. I forced Gavrin's hand. I made it clear to him that if he didn't take away the red card, his career, his life, would be over. He had a family, Ruda. A wife, children, he couldn't afford to cross me. So, he did what I asked. He pulled the red card back, and you won the championship. The room seemed to close in around Ruda as the full weight of his father's confession settled upon him. His victory, the achievement he had held up as proof of his worth, had been tainted, manipulated by the man he had trusted above all others. Why didn't you tell me? Ruda asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Why let me believe that I'd won fairly, that I'd earned the title on my own? The weight of promises. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the unspoken words that hung between father and son. Ruda sat at his father Hurus's bedside, the normally robust figure of his father reduced to a frail shell by the ravages of illness. Despite his physical decline, there was a fire in Hurus's eyes that refused to be extinguished, a fire fueled by the weight of the secrets he had carried for so long. Secrets that were now being laid bare in the final moments of his life. Hurus took a deep breath, the effort seeming to drain the last vestiges of his strength. He knew that what he was about to confess would change everything, would forever alter Ruda's perception of him, of the life they had built together, and of the man Ruda had become. But Hurus could not go to his grave without unburdening himself of the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Ruda, Hurus began, his voice a raspy whisper that trembled with the weight of his confession. There is something else I need to tell you, something I have kept hidden from you for far too long. It's about President Natsu and how he died. Ruda's heart skipped a beat at the mention of President Natsu, the former leader of Guerrillist whose assassination had sent shockwaves through the nation. It was an event that had paved the way for Ruda's rise to power, a tragedy that had been cloaked in mystery and suspicion. Ruda had always wondered who had orchestrated the assassination, but he had never expected the answer to come from his own father's lips. What are you saying, father? Ruda asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. What do you know about Natsu's death? Hurus closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to continue. When he opened them again, there was a look of deep sorrow and regret etched into his features. I know everything, Ruda. Because it was I who ordered his assassination. Ruda felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet, the shock of his father's confession leaving him reeling. You ordered it? You were the one who had Natsu killed. Hurus nodded slowly, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a physical burden. Yes, Ruda. It was me. I had just the same Hyenian assassin I hired to kill Kaki, eliminate Natsu. I couldn't allow him to continue as president. He was a threat to everything we had worked for, everything I had planned for you. Ruda struggled to process the enormity of what his father was saying. President Natsu had been a formidable leader, a man respected and feared in equal measure. His assassination had been a turning point in the history of Gorillist, a moment that had set the stage for Ruda's eventual rise to power. But to learn that his own father had been behind it, it was almost too much to bear. "Why, father?" Ruda demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Why would you do something like that? Wasn't there another way?" Horus looked at his son, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to transcend the physical pain he was enduring. "I did it for you, Ruda. Everything I've ever done has been for you. I wanted to clear the path for you, to ensure that you would have the power and the opportunity to lead Gorillist into the future. But Natsu, he stood in the way. He was too powerful, too entrenched in his ways. If he had remained in power, there would have been no place for you. No place for the future I envisioned." Ruda shook his head, struggling to reconcile the man who had raised him, the man he had always seen as a hero, with the man who was now confessing to such cold-blooded actions. "And Jess, you promised him something in return, didn't you?" Horus nodded again, his voice growing weaker as he continued. "Yes. I promised Jess that if you became president, I would help him become the president of Hyaenia. He was loyal to me, Ruda. He did what I asked without question, and in return, I gave him my word, a promise as strong as the mountains of Gorillist, that when the time came, you would use your power to make him president." Ruda's mind raced as he tried to piece together the implications of what his father was saying. If what Horus said was true, then Ruda's rise to power had been built on a foundation of lies, betrayal, and murder. The title of president, the power he wielded, it had all been tainted by the blood of those who had been sacrificed to clear the way for him. But how? Ruda asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you plan to make just the president of Hyaenia?" Horus's breathing grew labored, each word a struggle as he fought against the encroaching darkness. "The plan was for you to conquer 6 countries, to expand Gorillist's power and influence. Once you had solidified your position, you would force President Murray of Hyaenia to step down, to make way for Jess. It was all part of the plan, Ruda. A plan to secure your place at the top, to ensure that nothing and no one could stand in your way." Ruda felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized the full extent of his father's machinations. His victories, his conquests, they had all been part of a grand design, a design that had been set in motion long before he had ever taken the reins of power. "And what if I refuse?" Ruda asked, his voice filled with defiance. "What if I don't want to fulfill this promise you made to Jess? What if I want to lead Gorillist in my own way, without resorting to the same tactics you used?" Horus's eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness as he looked at his son. "That is your choice, Ruda. I have done what I believed was necessary, but I cannot dictate your path. You are your own man, and you must decide how you will lead. But know this, promises are not made lightly, and breaking them comes with consequences." Ruda remained silent for a long moment, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him like a leaden shroud. He had always known that leadership came with difficult choices, but he had never imagined that those choices would be so steeped in darkness and deceit. "I understand, Father," Ruda finally said, his voice tinged with sorrow. "But I will lead differently. I will not follow in your footsteps, not in this way. I will find my own path, one that is built on truth and integrity, not on lies and betrayal." Horus smiled weakly, the last vestiges of his strength fading away. "That's all I ever wanted for you, Ruda. To be strong, to be a leader, but I see now that you have surpassed me. You will be the leader Gorillist needs, one who can guide our people into a new era. I'm proud of you, my son." Web of deceit. The low hum of the machinery in the dimly lit room created a rhythm that matched the heavy tension between father and son. Ruda, seated beside the bed where his father Horus lay, was engulfed in a whirlwind of emotions. The revelations over the past few hours had been earth-shattering. The man he had idolized all his life, the man who had shaped him into the leader he was today, was now confessing to deeds that Ruda could hardly believe. Yet, a gnawing suspicion had been growing in Ruda's mind, an inkling that perhaps the depths of his father's manipulations went even further than what had already been confessed. Hurus, frail and clearly struggling with the weight of his own conscience, had just finished recounting another secret that had darkened his soul for years. But Ruda was not satisfied. He could sense there was more that Hurus had yet to admit. "Father," Ruda began, his voice calm but edged with a steely resolve, "there's something else that has been troubling me. Something that I've tried to dismiss, but can no longer ignore." Hurus's eyes, though clouded with age and weariness, still held the sharpness of a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of power for decades. He knew what was coming before Ruda even spoke the next words. "I need to know about Kodo," Ruda continued, his gaze never leaving his father's. "The way he was framed for President Natsu's assassination, it never sat right with me. I've always felt that there was more to it. And now, after everything you've told me, I can't help but wonder, was it you? Did you frame Kodo for Natsu's murder?" Hurus closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping his lips as the last of his defenses crumbled. There was no point in denying it anymore, no point in holding back the truth that had haunted him. "Yes, Ruda," Hurus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I orchestrated it. But it wasn't easy, and it wasn't without cost." Ruda's stomach churned as the confirmation hit him. Kodo had been a formidable figure, a man of principle who had stood firm in the face of pressure. Yet, all of that had been stripped away in a single, devastating blow. "How?" Ruda asked, the word laced with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "How did you do it?" Hurus shifted slightly in the bed, the effort of the movement betraying his physical weakness. "It was all about creating a believable narrative," he began. "I knew that simply accusing Kodo wouldn't be enough. There had to be evidence, something concrete that could tie him to the crime." Hurus's eyes glazed over slightly as he delved back into the memory of his darkest schemes. "I used a trusted banker, someone who owed me a debt, someone I knew would do whatever I asked. Through him, I arranged for a substantial sum of money to be transferred from Kodo's account in Gorillas to an account in Hyaenia." Ruda's fists clenched as he listened. "You forged the transaction?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "No," Hurus corrected, his voice carrying the weight of the plan's complexity. "It was Kodo's money, legitimate funds from his account. The banker was able to access Kodo's accounts because Kodo had trusted him completely. The transfer was real, and that's what made the frame so convincing." "And in Hyaenia?" Ruda pressed. "What happened there?" "In Hyaenia," Hurus continued, his voice growing softer as if the weight of the confession was too much to bear, "I coordinated with Jus. He was crucial to the plan. Jus had a subordinate, Womu, who was skilled in dealing with sensitive matters. Womu was the one who received the money on the Hyenian end, making it look like Kodo was funding a plot to assassinate President Natsu." Ruda's heart sank as he realized the extent of the deception. The web that Hurus had spun was intricate and insidious, designed to entrap Kodo without leaving any trace of Hurus's involvement. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, one that had utterly destroyed an innocent man's life. Once the money was transferred, Hurus explained, it was easy to create the narrative that Kodo had been plotting against Natsu all along. The timing was perfect, right after the assassination, when everyone was looking for someone to blame. All it took was a few well-placed rumors, some doctored evidence, and the trap was set. "Why, father?" Ruda asked, his voice trembling with anger. "Why would you do this? Why frame him for something he didn't do?" Hurus's eyes filled with a deep sorrow as he met his son's gaze. "Because Kodo had too much influence, too much support among the people. If I hadn't taken him out of the picture, he would have been a serious obstacle to your rise. I had to clear the path for you, and Kodo was in the way." Ruda shook his head, his mind reeling from the revelation. "So you destroyed him," he said, his voice heavy with accusation. "You destroyed an innocent man just to ensure that I would have a clear path to the presidency." Hurus didn't deny it. He knew that any justification he could offer would be hollow in the face of the truth. "I did what I thought was necessary," he said, his voice barely audible. "I did it all for you, Ruda. To make sure that you would have the power and the opportunity to lead." Ruda turned away, his emotions a tumultuous storm within him. The father he had loved and respected had become a stranger to him, a man who had committed unspeakable acts in the name of ambition. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. But there was still more to uncover, more that Eurus had done to secure Ruda's path to power. And what about Hetty? Ruda asked, his voice steadying as he forced himself to confront the full extent of his father's manipulations. What role did he play in all of this? Eurus's expression grew pained as he realized there was no escaping the truth. Hetty was instrumental in securing your presidency, Eurus admitted. After Kodo was out of the way, I needed to make sure that the far-right lawmakers, the extremists in the lower house, would back you. Hetty was the key to that. Ruda's eyes narrowed as he remembered the smooth-talking congressman who had been one of his earliest supporters. How did you convince him? He asked, his voice laced with suspicion. I promised him power, Eurus replied, his voice growing fainter. Hetty has always been ambitious, always looking for a way to climb higher. I convinced him that supporting you would be his ticket to greater influence, that once you were in power, he would be rewarded. But it wasn't just about promises, was it? Ruda pressed, his mind racing as he pieced together the puzzle. You must have done more than that to secure their support. Eurus nodded weakly, the effort of speaking clearly taking its toll on him. I used my influence, he confessed. I pulled strings, made deals, and applied pressure where it was needed. I reminded Hetty and the others that the nation was on the brink of war, that we needed a strong leader, a military leader, at the helm. And they agreed. Ruda felt a chill run down his spine as he realized just how deep his father's machinations went. Hetty, along with the other far-right lawmakers, had been swayed not just by promises of power, but by fears that without a strong leader like Ruda, the nation would fall into chaos. And the vote? Ruda asked, dreading the answer. Eurus's eyes closed for a moment as he gathered his strength to continue. The vote was never in doubt, he said finally. Hetty and the far-right extremists had the numbers. They convinced the lower house that a military leader was essential in a time of crisis. The vote passed overwhelmingly in your favor. Ruda clenched his fists, his mind awash with conflicting emotions. He had always believed that he had earned his position through his own merit, through his skill as a leader and a strategist. But now, he was forced to confront the reality that his rise to power had been orchestrated by his father, manipulated behind the scenes to ensure that he would ascend to the presidency. Why didn't you tell me? Ruda demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. Why let me believe that I had earned this, that I had won the support of the lower house on my own? Eurus opened his eyes, the pain of his son's accusation clear on his face. Because I wanted you to believe it, he replied, his voice filled with regret. I wanted you to have the confidence to lead, to know that you were capable of guiding this nation through the darkest times. I thought that if you knew the truth, it would undermine everything we had worked for. Ruda shook his head, unable to contain the anger that had been building within him. But you lied to me, he said, his voice rising. You manipulated everything, Kaki's death, the lower house vote, my entire career. How am I supposed to lead when everything I thought I knew was built on lies? Eurus's eyes filled with tears as he reached out a trembling hand to his son. I'm sorry, Ruda, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing what was best for you, for our family, for Gorillist. But I see now that I was wrong. I see now that I've burdened you with my own sins. Ruda stood there, his emotions in turmoil, as he looked down at his father, the man who had shaped his life in ways he was only now beginning to understand. The man who had lied, manipulated, and betrayed everyone around him, all in the name of ambition. But despite everything, Ruda couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pity for his father. Eurus was a man who had lost his way, who had allowed his love for his son to drive him to the darkest depths of morality. He had done terrible things, yes, but he had done them out of a twisted sense of love and loyalty. I don't know if I can forgive you, Father, Ruda said quietly, his voice tinged with sorrow. But I do know that I will carry the lessons you've taught me forward. I will lead this nation with honesty and integrity, and I will strive to undo the damage that has been done. Eurus nodded weakly, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and pride. That's all I ever wanted for you, Ruta, he whispered. To be strong, to be a leader, to be better than I was. The room was cloaked in a haunting silence, disturbed only by the persistent hum of medical devices and the strained breathing of Eurus. Ruta sat by his father's side, his heart weighed down by the shocking truths he had just uncovered. The man he had admired, who had molded his life and led him to power, had confessed to sins that shattered the heroic image Ruta had always held of him. Eurus, once strong and commanding, now lay frail and vulnerable, his body ravaged by illness and his soul heavy with the secrets he had harbored for so long. The confession had drained the life from him, each word a battle as he unraveled the tangled web of deceit, manipulation, and betrayal that had defined his existence. Yet, in those final moments, there was a sense of release, as if unburdening his soul had granted him a measure of peace. Ruta, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had learned, was engulfed in a deep sadness. The anger and betrayal that had surged through him moments before were replaced by profound sorrow as he realized that his father, the man who had sacrificed so much to secure his success, even at the expense of others, was slipping away from him. Eurus's eyes, once sharp and purposeful, were now dull and lifeless, the spark within them fading. He looked up at his son, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth, as if to convey that, despite everything, he had no regrets about what he had done for Ruta. I'm sorry, Ruta, Eurus whispered, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry for the burdens I've placed on you, for the sins I've committed in your name. But I want you to know, I've always loved you. Everything I've done, I did it because I believed in you. Tears filled Ruta's eyes as he listened to his father's final words. Despite the darkness of Eurus's actions, Ruta couldn't ignore the love that had driven those choices, a flawed and misguided love, but love nonetheless. I know, Father, Ruta replied, his voice thick with emotion. I know you did it all for me. And despite everything, I love you. Eurus's smile broadened, a peaceful expression settling on his face. The tension in his body eased, and his breathing slowed, becoming more labored. He squeezed Ruta's hand, using the last of his strength. Lead Gorillist well, my son, Eurus whispered, his eyes closing. Be the leader. I always knew you could be. The sins of the father. The room was steeped in a somber stillness, broken only by the rhythmic hum of medical equipment and the labored breaths of Eurus. Ruta sat beside his father, his heart heavy with the weight of the revelations that had just unfolded. The man he had idolized, the figure who had shaped his life and guided him to power, had confessed to sins that shattered the heroic image Ruta had held of him. Eurus, once so strong and commanding, now lay frail and vulnerable, his body ravaged by illness and his soul burdened by the secrets he had kept for so long. The confession had taken its toll, each word a struggle as he unraveled the web of deceit, manipulation, and betrayal that had been his life's work. And yet, in those final moments, there was a sense of release, as if the act of confessing had unburdened him, allowing him to find peace at last. Ruta, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had learned, felt a deep sorrow settling over him. The anger and betrayal that had surged through him moments ago now gave way to a profound grief as he realized that his father, the man who had done so much to ensure his success, even at the cost of others, was slipping away from him. Eurus's eyes, once sharp and filled with purpose, were now dull and glassy, the life within them slowly fading. He looked up at his son, the corners of his mouth twitching into a faint smile, as if to say that despite everything, he had no regrets about what he had done for Ruta. I'm sorry, Ruta, Eurus whispered, his voice so weak it was barely audible. I'm sorry for the burdens I've placed on you, for the sins I've committed in your name. But I want you to know, I've always loved you. Everything I did because I believed in you. Tears welled up in Ruta's eyes as he listened to his father's final words. Despite the darkness of Eurus's actions, Ruta couldn't deny the love that had driven those choices, a love that was flawed and misguided, but love nonetheless. I know, Father, Ruta said, his voice choked with emotion. I know you did it all for me. and despite everything, I love you too." Eurus's smile widened slightly, a look of peace settling over his features. The tension that had gripped his body eased, and his breathing grew slower, more labored. He squeezed Ruda's hand weakly, the last of his strength fading. "Lead gorillist well, my son," Eurus murmured, his eyes closing as he spoke. "Be the leader. I always knew you could be." Ruda nodded, unable to speak as the tears spilled down his cheeks. He held his father's hand tightly, unwilling to let go even as he felt the life slipping away from Eurus's body. With one final, shuddering breath, Eurus passed away, his hand going limp in Ruda's grasp. The room fell into a deep silence, the steady hum of the medical equipment now the only sound that remained. Ruda sat there for a long time, holding his father's hand, his mind a whirlwind of grief, anger, and sorrow. The man who had been his guide, his mentor, and his hero was gone, leaving behind a legacy that was both triumphant and tarnished. Veiled legacy. Ruda's anguished cry echoed through the room, a raw sound that carried the weight of his grief and the deep pain of loss. Eurus, the man he had idolized, the father who had guided him through life with an iron will and an unyielding sense of purpose, was gone. The air felt heavy, thick with the finality of death and the burden of the revelations that had come to light in Eurus's last moments. As Ruda clutched his father's lifeless hand, his mind reeled from the shock of the confessions Eurus had made. The once proud image of his father had been shattered, replaced by a figure who was as much a manipulator as he was a mentor, a man whose legacy was now tainted by the dark deeds he had orchestrated. The hero Ruda had always known was gone, replaced by a stranger whose actions had cast a long shadow over everything he had once believed. In the midst of his grief, Ruda barely registered the presence of Durica, his wife, who had quietly entered the room. She had come bearing medicine, unaware of the harrowing conversation that had taken place just moments before. As she stood in the doorway, Durica hesitated, sensing the gravity of the moment. A curtain separated her from the scene unfolding between father and son, but she could hear the muffled voices, the words laced with sorrow and regret. Durica's keen mind, always sharp and observant, began to piece together the fragments of the conversation. The hints and half-formed phrases she had overheard hinted at a truth far darker and more complex than she had ever imagined. The man who had been so revered, not just by Ruda but by the entire gorillist nation, was revealed to be a pseudo-gentleman, a master of schemes who had pulled the strings behind the scenes to achieve his own ends. As the reality of Eurus's actions sank in, Durica felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had always known Eurus as a man of power, but she had never suspected the depths of his machinations. His carefully cultivated image had masked a lifetime of manipulation, deceit, and betrayal. And now, as she watched her husband mourn, Durica realized that the legacy Eurus had left behind was more complicated and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Her thoughts turned to Kodo, the man who had been wrongly accused and unjustly condemned as part of Eurus's grand design. Durica's heart ached for him, for the life that had been destroyed by the lies and deceit that Eurus had woven. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought of the pain Kodo must have endured, the injustice that had been done to him in the name of securing Ruda's rise to power. And then there was Xion, the mysterious figure whose name had been whispered in the shadows of the conversation between Eurus and Ruda. Xion, whose identity remained shrouded in mystery, was somehow connected to the web of secrets and lies that Eurus had spun. Durica couldn't shake the feeling that Xion held the key to understanding the full extent of Eurus's schemes, but who was he? What role had he played in this dark narrative? And what had become of him? As these questions swirled in her mind, Durica felt a deep sense of unease settle over her. Eurus's death had brought an end to his life, but it had also left behind a legacy of unanswered questions, unresolved tensions, and a future that was anything but certain. The truth, she realized, was far from complete. There were still pieces missing, still shadows lurking in the corners of Eurus's carefully constructed world. Ruda's sobs quieted as the reality of his father's passing began to sink in. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a void that no amount of tears could fill. Eurus was gone, and with him went the chance to seek answers to the questions that now plagued Ruda's mind. The man who had shaped his life, for better or worse, was no longer there to guide him, to offer advice, or to explain the choices he had made. Feeling the warmth of Durika's hand on his shoulder, Ruda looked up, his eyes red and swollen from crying. Durika met his gaze with a look of understanding, her own grief mingling with the resolve that had begun to take root within her. "I'm so sorry, Ruda," she whispered, her voice filled with compassion. "I can't imagine what you're going through right now." Ruda nodded, unable to find the words to express the tumult of emotions that roiled within him. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of confusion and sorrow, with no clear sense of direction. The father he had known was gone, and in his place was the stark reality of a man whose actions had left a trail of destruction in their wake. "We have to figure out the truth," Ruda finally said, his voice hoarse from crying. "We can't let his actions go unanswered. Kodo. Xian, there's so much we still don't know." Durika nodded in agreement, her mind already turning to the task ahead. She had always been a woman of action, and she knew that they couldn't afford to let Eurus's legacy define their future. There were too many lives at stake, too many people who had been hurt by the decisions Eurus had made in the shadows. "We'll find out what happened," Durika promised, her voice steady and determined. "We'll uncover the truth, no matter how difficult it may be. But for now, you need to rest. You've been through so much, and you need time to heal." Ruda knew she was right, but the thought of resting, of stepping back from the turmoil that had consumed his life, seemed impossible. There was too much at stake, too many questions that demanded answers. But as he looked into Durika's eyes, he saw the love and support that had sustained him through so many challenges, and he knew that he couldn't face this new chapter alone. "You're right," he said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "We'll face this together. But I need to know. I need to understand what he did. I need to know who Xian is, and what role he played in all of this." "We'll find out," Durika reassured him, her hand gently squeezing his. "But for now, let's take things one step at a time. We'll uncover the truth, and we'll make sure that justice is served." As they stood together in the quiet room, the weight of Eurus's legacy pressed down on them both. The path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but they knew that they couldn't turn back. There were too many lives hanging in the balance, too many unanswered questions that demanded their attention. Together, they would face the challenges that lay ahead, uncover the truth behind the veil of secrets that Eurus had left behind, and ensure that the future they built was one defined by honesty, integrity, and a commitment to justice. And as they took the first steps on this new journey, they knew that the road would be long and difficult, but they were prepared to face it together.